We had a good update from Minister LeBlanc. He just gave us a bit the state of play in the way that, things are complex. I think Canadians have understood that. But also looking what happened with our colleagues in Mexico, the discussion in the United States. I mean, the focus today was really to see what's coming, but also to focus on what we can control.
Canada's finance minister just sent Washington a message it didn't expect. Trade talks under CUSMA are still ongoing, but Canada is no longer structuring its future around American unpredictability. While Donald Trump publicly claims he's ending trade negotiations, Ottawa is quietly doing something far more consequential. It is preparing for a world where U.S. volatility is no longer Canada's defining risk. This is not a moment of panic. It is a moment of recalibration. This week, Canada's Finance Minister François-Philippe Champagne confirmed that discussions under CUSMA, the North American Trade Agreement, are continuing with the United States. His remarks followed high-level meetings with provincial finance ministers, the Bank of Canada, and Canada's trade leadership, all focused on preparing for the mandatory CUSMA review scheduled for 2026. The timing matters. Donald Trump is now in his second term as U.S. president, once again turning trade policy into a political weapon. Washington has floated ideas ranging from sector-by-sector agreements to openly questioning whether CUSMA should even survive in its current form. Public statements from the White House suggest trade talks are over, even as behind-the-scenes conversations continue. Champagne's message was deliberately calm. Canada understands the environment it is operating in. The United States is unpredictable. Policy signals change quickly, and negotiations increasingly play out in public rather than through quiet diplomacy. The question is no longer whether Canada can control U.S. behavior. The question is how Canada insulates itself from it. The contrast between Ottawa and Washington could not be clearer. Trump governs trade through shock. Canada governs trade through preparation. Champagne openly acknowledged what Canadian officials no longer pretend otherwise. Canada cannot control policy south of the border. Under Trump, tariffs appear and disappear without warning. Long-standing agreements are treated as leverage rather than commitments. Political theater often replaces economic logic. But instead of reacting to every threat, Canada has chosen to slow the game down. Champagne emphasized that roughly 85% of Canada-U.S. trade remains exempt under CUSMA, giving Canada the lowest effective cost of entry into the U.S. market among major trading partners. That is not a talking point. It is strategic breathing room. It allows Canada to keep trading while quietly adjusting its long-term posture. More importantly, Canada is no longer pretending that preferential access to the U.S. market is a permanent guarantee. The language coming from Ottawa has shifted. The focus is no longer on dependence, but on durability, not on proximity, but on options. This is not anti-American, it is pro-Canadian. Champagne did not downplay the damage caused by tariffs. He spoke directly about workers who feel the impact most sharply. Steel workers in Hamilton, auto workers in Oshawa, forestry communities, farmers and fishers across the country. The pain is real and it is uneven. Tariffs hit specific sectors harder than others, even when those sectors are deeply integrated into U.S. supply chains. That is the paradox of Trump's trade policy. It claims to protect American industry while actively disrupting the North American production system that keeps those industries competitive. Canada is not denying that reality. Unlike Washington, Ottawa is not pretending tariffs are painless or temporary. The government has focused on targeted support for affected industries while accelerating structural changes that reduce exposure to future shocks. That includes strengthening domestic supply chains, investing in advanced manufacturing, securing critical minerals, and positioning Canada as a stable energy and technology partner in a volatile global economy. These are not short-term fixes, they are long-term insurance policies. One of the most revealing moments in Champagne's remarks had little to do with the United States directly. He pointed to growing international interest in Canada from Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. Countries and investors are seeking stability, predictability, and rule of law at a time when global uncertainty is higher than it was during the 2008 financial crisis. Canada is benefiting from that contrast. While Washington debates tariffs and threats, Canada is hosting G7 meetings, deepening economic and security ties with allies, and attracting investment precisely because it does not govern by impulse. In a world where trade is increasingly linked to national security and political alignment, Canada's reputation matters. Trump's America sells leverage and confrontation. Canada sells consistency and credibility. That difference is quietly reshaping how global partners view North America. There is no illusion in Ottawa about what lies ahead. The 2026 USMA review will be contentious. Washington may threaten withdrawal. Tariffs may resurface as negotiating tools. Public pressure campaigns will intensify. But Canada enters that process more prepared than it was during Trump's first term. It has diversified trade relationships, it has reinforced domestic resilience, and it has learned that reacting emotionally to U.S. pressure only strengthens it. Experience has replaced anxiety. Champagne's tone reflected that confidence. Canada will continue to engage the United States. It will continue to defend its interests, but it will no longer assume that stability automatically flows from proximity. The relationship is evolving whether Washington likes it or not. There's a quieter shift happening beneath Washington's noise. Every time U.S. trade policy swings with politics, Canada gains something valuable: credibility. Global partners and investors respond to stability, not volume. Canada is positioning itself as a reliable anchor in areas where uncertainty now carries real costs, from energy security and critical minerals to advanced manufacturing and artificial intelligence. These are not talking points. They are active conversations with allies who want supply chains that survive political cycles. Champagne's focus on controlling what Canada can control reflects that reality. As Canada removes internal trade barriers, strengthens domestic production, and deepens markets beyond the United States, its leverage improves naturally, not through confrontation, but through options. The United States remains Canada's largest trading partner, but it is no longer the only pillar supporting Canada's economic future. That changes the tone of every negotiation heading into the USMA review. When alternatives exist, pressure loses its edge. Donald Trump believes pressure forces compliance. Canada is demonstrating something else entirely. Pressure forces adaptation. CUSMA talks may still be ongoing, but Canada's economic future is no longer hostage to American mood swings. If the United States wants a stable, integrated North American economy, Canada remains a willing partner. If not, Canada is already building alternatives. As 2026 approaches, the real question is not whether Canada is ready. It is whether Washington understands that the leverage it once relied on is quietly slipping away, because this time Canada is not flinching.
Canadians have become united in the face of the fundamental change in U.S. trade policy. That's their choice. Yesterday, Canada and the UAE signed, finally, a Foreign Investment Promotion and Partnership Agreement, or FIFA. This will unlock tens of billions of dollars in investment between our two countries. And for Canadians, it's an opportunity to expand for our engineering firms, our construction companies, our aerospace sector, our agri-food, seafood producers, our AI firms.
Canada has just delivered one of the clearest signs yet that the country is stepping into a new global role. In Abu Dhabi, Prime Minister Mark Carney unveiled a sweeping $115 billion investment plan that reads less like a routine economic announcement and more like a declaration of national confidence. For years, Canada played cautiously on the global stage, especially when dealing with the United States. But this time, Carney made something unmistakably clear. Canada is done waiting for Washington's permission. The country is building its future on its own terms with partners who actually want to build. At the Canada-UAE Investment Summit, Carney addressed a room full of investors, ministers, CEOs, and Emirati leaders. It was the kind of audience that signals seriousness, people who move capital, shape energy markets, and influence the technological future. Carney walked them through what Canada has already launched. In the span of just a few months, his government has announced more than $10 billion worth of nation-building projects. These include a new deepwater port project in Montreal, expanded energy corridors linking provinces, critical mineral highways running from mines to global markets, and major clean electricity expansions meant to double Canada's already 80% clean grid. But the investment tally was only the surface. What mattered even more was the partnership that Carney came to cement. Canada and the UAE signed a long-awaited Foreign Investment Protection Agreement, unlocking tens of billions in future deals. Carney and the UAE leadership also agreed to begin negotiating a comprehensive economic partnership agreement, a modern trade deal designed to strip away tariffs, open new markets, and anchor long-term supply chains between the two economies. Carney underscored how deeply aligned the two countries already are. Both are energy superpowers. Both sit at the intersection of global trade routes. Both want to lead the AI, digital infrastructure, and clean technology revolutions that will define this century. And both are willing to invest real capital to make it happen. Carney spoke with striking bluntness when he said that Canadians have become united in the face of fundamental changes in U.S. trade policy. It wasn't rhetoric, it was the practical reality facing the country. Under President Donald Trump's second term, the U.S. has returned to a hardline protectionist approach, sweeping tariffs, aggressive reshoring demands, and policy shifts that disrupt established supply chains. Reuters reporting through 2025 confirms that Canadian exporters have been diversifying because of instability, and the Bank of Canada has even lowered growth forecasts due to U.S. trade uncertainty. Carney's speech captured a turning point that has been building quietly for years. Canada no longer treats Washington's decisions as the gravitational center of its economy. Instead, it is preparing for a future where the U.S. is just one partner among many. This shift isn't anti-American, it's pro-Canadian, and that distinction matters. Canada's strategy stretches far beyond this summit. Carney outlined an economic map that now runs through Asia, Europe, and the Middle East, a multi-engine model designed to eliminate dependence on any single market. Canada has already finalized an economic partnership with Indonesia and is deep in negotiations with Thailand and the Philippines, with a full ASEAN deal expected next year. Even long-frozen relationships with India and China are reopening, highlighted by Carney's turning point meeting with Xi Jinping at APEC. All of this reinforces a simple point. Canada is positioning itself at the center of several global networks, not just North America. That shift matters as the 2026 USMCA review approaches, giving Ottawa leverage it hasn't had in decades.
A standout moment in Carney's speech was his praise for the UAE's clean energy achievements. Masdar's 70-gigawatt clean power portfolio, including the world's largest solar plus battery project, is redefining what renewable baseload looks like. Carney linked this directly to Canada's ambitions, a grid already among the world's cleanest and a plan to double capacity within a decade. This puts Canada and the UAE on the same forward trajectory, while the United States, under Trump, moves in the opposite direction by rolling back clean energy incentives and freezing offshore wind development. As U.S. momentum slows, Canada and the UAE are building the industrial ecosystem of the future. Carney highlighted another crucial point. A billion-dollar agreement now close to finalization that will expand critical minerals processing capacity inside Canada. This is on top of the federal government's new $2 billion Minerals Sovereign Fund and more than $10 billion earmarked for mines-to-port infrastructure. For the world's clean tech economy, this is not a side story, it's a core story. Reuters and AP coverage consistently note that the United States remains heavily dependent on Chinese minerals because it lacks processing facilities at home. Trump's tariffs on Canadian metals have only added to U.S. supply instability. Canada is seizing that vacuum, partnering with nations like the UAE that need secure access to these minerals. In global terms, this positions Canada as the backbone of the Western critical minerals supply chain, something the United States cannot replicate quickly under current policies. Carney ended his speech by describing Canada as a AAA-rated, fiscally disciplined, stable democracy with some of the strongest institutions in the world. But it wasn't bragging, it was positioning. Canada is making itself the safe, predictable anchor in a volatile global economy. The fact that Canadian pension funds holding more than $2 trillion in assets are heading to the UAE early next year is a signal of intent. This is a two-way relationship built on scale, credibility, and ambition. It is not symbolic diplomacy. It is structural realignment. Canada is no longer knocking on doors asking to participate. It is setting the table and inviting the world to come to it.
Carney's $115 billion plan is more than a domestic investment package. It is the blueprint of a new global posture. Canada is stepping into a world where partnerships define power, where clean energy leadership determines competitiveness, and where countries thrive not by clinging to old alliances, but by building new ones. For decades, Canada's economic story was almost exclusively tied to the United States. Today, that story is being rewritten. The UAE is one pillar, ASEAN is another, East Asia is a rising engine, and the US, while still critical, is no longer the only destination. The question now is how quickly Canada can turn this moment into momentum, and whether the United States is ready to accept that Canada no longer lives in its shadow.
Last week, Prime Minister Mark Carney met with Chinese President Xi Jinping in South Korea.
We agreed this meeting marked a turning point,
especially as U.S. President Donald Trump continues to wage his global trade war. China's foreign ministry announcing the government is allowing group tours to Canada again, saying it will further people-to-people exchanges.
After years of diplomatic chill and lost opportunity, a quiet but monumental shift is underway. China has officially reinstated Canada on its list of approved travel destinations for group tours, a move that signals more than just the return of tourists. It marks a thaw in one of the most strained relationships of the past decade, and it comes at a time when global trade politics are once again defined by confrontation from Washington. As President Donald Trump escalates tariffs and trade wars, Canada, under Prime Minister Mark Carney, is charting a different path, one rooted in diplomacy, diversification, and quiet strategic rebuilding. 这周, Beijing's Ministry of Culture and Tourism confirmed that Chinese group travel to Canada can officially resume. It's a decision that carries heavy symbolism. Chinese tourists were once a cornerstone of Canada's tourism economy, making up roughly 60% of many agencies' bookings before relations froze in 2018. That collapse began after the arrest of Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou in Vancouver on a U.S. extradition request, an event that triggered China's detention of Canadians Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, leading to a diplomatic ice age. Even when China began reopening to global tourism in 2023, Canada remained excluded from its approved list, a pointed snub that cost the Canadian tourism sector millions. Now that exclusion is over. The announcement followed a series of diplomatic gestures. Foreign Minister Melanie Joly's visit to Beijing and, most notably, Prime Minister Mark Carney's 40-minute bilateral meeting with Xi Jinping at the APEC summit in South Korea, where both leaders described their talks as a turning point. For the first time in years, Ottawa and Beijing are speaking the same diplomatic language, reconnection through pragmatism. This reopening isn't just about tourism. It's about trust and about a new kind of geopolitical realism. For Canada, the timing is deliberate. Under the Carney government, Ottawa has been pivoting toward Asia, signing new defense and economic partnerships with South Korea and engaging ASEAN in free trade negotiations. Re-establishing functional ties with China is a logical next step, especially as Trump's America First agenda continues to disrupt global trade stability. China, too, has its motives. With Donald Trump re-elected and waging tariff battles against nearly every major economy, including China, Canada, and the EU, Beijing sees value in easing tensions with secondary Western partners. Reopening tourism to Canada sends a message. China is willing to reward cooperation and dialogue over confrontation. Beyond symbolism, this marks a test of how far Carney's independent foreign policy can stretch before it collides with Washington's expectations. Ottawa knows that the U.S. will watch this development closely, especially as Trump pushes for a tougher North American alignment against China ahead of the 2026 USMCA review. Yet Carney's strategy is rooted in long-term calculation, not provocation. By engaging Beijing through tourism, education, and clean tech cooperation rather than direct trade deals, he's building a soft bridge that strengthens Canada's economic leverage without triggering American retaliation. It's a subtle but high-stakes balancing act, one that defines Canada's new role in the post-Trump global order. Mark Carney's approach is notably cautious, what his advisors call measured engagement. He isn't seeking a full reset or romantic revival of the pre-2018 relationship. Instead, Carney's goal is to stabilize economic channels, reopen people-to-people ties, and avoid overdependence on the United States. Analysts say this is classic Carney, a former central banker applying steady, data-driven logic to diplomacy. His message, delivered quietly but firmly at APEC, was simple. Canada will engage where it benefits Canadians, regardless of Washington's political mood. By framing China as a partner in selective cooperation, not an adversary, but not an ally either, Carney is redefining Canada's global position: independent, pragmatic, and open-eyed. Meanwhile, south of the border, the contrast couldn't be sharper. President Trump's second-term trade crusade has triggered economic whiplash, tariffs up to 100%, supply chains in chaos, and inflation eating into consumer confidence. Trump's hardline stance on China, combined with 25% tariffs on Canadian goods, has pushed Ottawa to seek alternatives. Ironically, the more Washington pressures its allies, the more those allies look elsewhere. The reopening of Chinese tourism to Canada, right after Carney's meeting with Xi, is a symbolic rejection of Trump's isolationism. It suggests that U.S. influence, once absolute in shaping Canada's foreign relations, is no longer the only game in town. In short, Trump's economic wall is pushing neighbors to build new doors. The immediate impact will be felt across Canada's tourism and retail sectors. Before the freeze, Chinese visitors were the world's biggest spenders per capita, staying longer, traveling farther, and spending more than tourists from any other country. Their return could inject hundreds of millions into local economies, from Vancouver to Banff to Toronto. But the broader significance is strategic. Every flight landing from Beijing or Shanghai represents not just economic recovery, but a restoration of trust. Ottawa officials describe this as people-first diplomacy, the idea that cultural and economic connections can thaw what politics froze. This moment fits a larger pattern unfolding across the Asia-Pacific. While Trump strengthens military trade blocs with Japan, South Korea, and Australia, Canada is quietly building bridges in parallel, engaging China, deepening ASEAN ties, and promoting its Trade Diversification 2035 strategy to double non-U.S. exports. In effect, Carney is crafting a new Canadian doctrine, one that accepts the world as it is, fragmented, competitive, multipolar, and seeks to navigate it with economic intelligence instead of ideological loyalty. For Beijing, welcoming Canadian tourists again is a low-cost, high-impact gesture that buys goodwill and signals normalcy. For Ottawa, it's a small but crucial proof that its Asian pivot is working. For years, the Canada-China relationship was frozen in mistrust, collateral damage from great power rivalry. But this week's announcement, modest as it seems, may mark the first real thaw. As Chinese tourists prepare to once again walk through Banff's mountain trails or Niagara's mist, Canada is walking its own path, one that leads away from dependency toward balance. Prime Minister Carney calls it a new era of strategic openness. The world may soon call it something else, the moment Canada quietly came of age as an independent global actor.
U.S. President Donald Trump's trade war has prompted a frantic search for new markets for Canadian trade.
I think that Canada would be very wise to start negotiating what China is putting on the table now. We keep talking about the fact that we've got to have new trading routes, new trading partners after what's happened with the Americans.
It began quietly, with a series of small but deliberate steps. While Washington doubled down on new tariffs and threats against Canada's auto sector, Beijing did something few expected. It extended an open hand. China offered to ease restrictions on Canadian agriculture, to welcome energy and minerals, and even to discuss joint opportunities in the fast-growing electric vehicle market. For decades, Canada's trade story revolved around its southern neighbor. Nearly 3/4 of its exports still travel across the border to the United States. But when President Donald Trump renewed his campaign of pressure, raising duties on metals, furniture, and now vehicles, Ottawa began to realize that relying on one market had become a vulnerability. In that moment, Canada didn't retaliate loudly. It changed direction. Trump's hardline strategy, meant to force Canada into submission, is now pushing it toward a new path, one that leads east toward China. The spark came from the auto industry. In early October, U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick told a Toronto audience that when it comes to vehicle production, it is America first, Canada second. His words carried the weight of Trump's new tariff threat, a 25% tax on cars and parts entering the U.S. from Canada. For Ontario, this was not just rhetoric, it was an existential problem. About 500,000 jobs in southern Ontario depend on the auto supply chain, which is deeply integrated with factories in Michigan, Ohio, and Illinois. Each vehicle assembled in Canada includes roughly 50% U.S.-made parts. Any disruption in that chain hurts both sides of the border. By the time Lutnick's comments made headlines, investors were already nervous. Ottawa's Trade Department estimated that a prolonged 25% tariff could cut Canada's annual auto exports by tens of billions of dollars and trigger layoffs across steel, aluminum, and manufacturing. Even in the U.S., analysts warned that the policy would raise production costs for American automakers. Yet, Trump showed no sign of backing down. His message was clear: production should move south no matter the cost. And that was the moment Canada began looking elsewhere for stability.
And what did we get in return from the Americans for putting ourselves in lockstep with them, for backing them up on their 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles? We got slapped with our own tariffs. That's how Donald Trump plays the game.
I have said multiple times, if Canada is ready to correct these practices, China will also respond accordingly.
While Washington was building barriers, Beijing was sending signals. Chinese officials opened discussions about renewed agricultural imports and potential cooperation in clean tech manufacturing. For Canada, still facing China's tariffs on canola imposed in previous years, it was a sign of thawing relations. According to trade analysts interviewed by CTV News, China's proposal was straightforward: Canada could reopen its market to Chinese electric vehicles, most priced between $35,000 and $40,000 Canadian dollars, and in return, Beijing would ease restrictions on Canadian farm exports. The idea was practical. Canadian consumers would gain access to affordable EVs, while farmers would regain access to a market of 1.4 billion people. The timing was no coincidence. Trump's 100% tariff on Chinese electric cars had effectively locked China out of the American market. Beijing was searching for a G7 partner willing to engage, and Canada's strained ties with Washington created that opportunity. Inside Ottawa, officials saw both risk and leverage. Canada could diversify trade while reminding the United States that loyalty cannot be one-sided. China was not replacing the U.S., but it was offering something Trump had taken away, a choice. By mid-October, Canada's shift was visible in both policy and tone. Prime Minister Mark Carney's government increased funding for domestic manufacturing, steel, and energy. The Federal Finance Ministry confirmed new support programs to offset losses from U.S. tariffs, while Ontario Premier Doug Ford publicly called for stronger protection of auto workers. At the same time, Ottawa kept its diplomatic language measured. It lifted certain retaliatory tariffs to encourage dialogue with Washington, but it held firm on a 25% levy for U.S. vehicles entering Canada. That single policy sent a clear message: Canada was willing to talk, but not to yield. Officials close to the trade file described the strategy as sectoral resilience. Instead of chasing one massive free trade agreement, Canada pursued smaller, industry-specific arrangements on steel, aluminum, agriculture, and potentially electric vehicles, with partners beyond the U.S. border. Beijing's outreach fit naturally into that framework. Canada's auto suppliers and EV battery producers were already exploring Asia for investment, while Chinese companies sought access to critical minerals like nickel and lithium from northern Ontario. For both sides, cooperation looked less like defiance and more like common sense. As one senior Canadian diplomat put it in a televised interview, the goal is no longer to depend on any single partner, but to build a network of equals. Trump's threats only accelerated that mindset. For the United States, the ripple effects are becoming clear. Trump's tariffs were designed to rebuild U.S. industry, but they are instead inflating costs and alienating allies. Data from the U.S. Department of Commerce show that steel and aluminum prices have climbed nearly 20% since early 2025. Vehicle prices are rising, and manufacturers are warning of lower profits. In the Great Lakes states, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Ohio, factories that depend on cross-border trade are struggling with shortages of Canadian parts. Economists from the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago recently reported that every 10% increase in tariff costs reduces Midwest manufacturing output by roughly 2%. Meanwhile, Canada's exploration of Chinese markets signals something Washington has long feared: that America's closest trading partner can function without it. Instead of isolating China, the White House has driven a wedge into North America's economic core. The more Trump insists on control, the less control he actually has. Canada's pivot toward China is not an act of rebellion. It is a lesson in adaptation. Faced with tariffs on steel, aluminum, softwood, and now vehicles, Ottawa did not surrender or retaliate blindly. It moved with quiet precision, securing new options for its economy and protecting its workers. The results are beginning to surface. Exports to Asian markets are slowly expanding. Talks with China are ongoing. And within Canada, the idea of depending solely on the United States is losing its appeal. Trump's campaign to dominate trade has exposed a deeper truth: influence cannot be enforced by threats. While Washington measures power in tariffs, Canada is learning to measure it in choices. If Ottawa and Beijing continue to align, America could lose more than contracts and factories. It could lose the trust that once defined its leadership. The tariff war Trump started was meant to make America strong again. But the calm, calculated response from Canada may be what truly reshapes the future of North American trade.